The world flipped and the cold hit him before he understood what was happening. Seawater forcing itself through the door seams and the porthole seals, and every gap the ship's body had. Cold that did not feel like temperature, but like a decision, like something with intention had decided to claim the space his body occupied. He was in his bunk, and then he was not in his bunk. He was on the wall that had become the floor, and the sound the vessel made was not the sound of a ship in a storm. It was the sound of a structure surrendering, metal screaming against the specific kind of force that metal is not built to absorb, the groan of a thing being unmade. The pressure hit his eardrums simultaneously from both sides, and the pain of it was sharp and immediate, and his hands went to his ears by reflex, and the darkness was absolute, and the water was at his ankles, and then his knees, and the ship was still moving, still rotating, still descending. This is the human limit. I am your host. If you want to understand the absolute floor of human fear, the place where the mind confronts what the body cannot survive and survives it anyway, subscribe to this channel right now and hit the like button, because what I am about to describe is 72 hours at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, in the dark, in the cold, in a space the size of a walk-in closet, listening to the ocean eat everything around him. This is the story of a man who became a ghost before the world knew he was still alive. Let me start at the moment it began. He was the ship's cook. He had been on the water for years, had worked tugboats across routes that took them far from shore into open ocean, had slept through storms that would have terrified landlocked people, because the water was his profession, and his profession required a specific relationship with fear, which is not the absence of it, but the management of it. He went to bed that night understanding the ocean was rough. He had slept through rough before. What came in the hours before dawn was not rough. The Atlantic in its fully committed state is not a weather event. It is a geological event, a temporary manifestation of forces that operate on scales the human body has no framework for processing. The wave that struck the tugboat produced a roll that exceeded the vessel's recovery angle, and the vessel, following physics rather than preference, did not recover. It went past vertical and continued rotating, and the water that had been outside the ship found all the places where the ship's integrity had degraded over years of heavy use, and it entered through those places the way water always enters when given the opportunity, which is completely and immediately and without negotiation. He was thrown, not metaphorically. His body was a loose object in a rotating container, and the container rotated, and he moved with it in ways that were not voluntary. Striking surfaces, losing orientation, losing the specific knowledge of which direction was up that human beings rely on so constantly and so completely that they do not know they are relying on it until it is gone. The water temperature at that depth in that season was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. That is 8 degrees above freezing, which sounds like warmth and is not warmth, is the specific temperature at which the body begins losing heat faster than it can produce it, is the temperature at which hypothermia does not wait but begins immediately. He moved through the flooding interior without being able to see. This is important. The darkness was not the darkness of a room without lights. It was the darkness of a sealed metal container filling with seawater at depth. A darkness that has no ambient light component whatsoever, that your eyes find nothing to work with because there is nothing there, that your brain processes as the specific panic response reserved for conditions where the visual system is producing no data at all. He moved by feel and by memory and by the specific desperate logic of someone who understands that the water is rising, and that rising water in a sealed metal space means there is a ceiling, and that ceiling has air against it, and that air is the only resource that matters. He found it by accident, and by persistence, and by the fact that the flooding was not uniform, that different compartments filled at different rates, depending on their structural integrity and their position relative to the breach. And one small compartment, a bathroom adjacent to his bunk cabin, had a geometry that allowed an air pocket to persist as the ship settled on the sea floor. He pushed himself into it, and the water was at his chest, and then at his waist as he found the highest available position, and he stood in the dark and breathed. The ship hit the bottom at 30 meters. 30 meters of seawater is approximately 3 atmospheres of pressure at the surface, plus 1 for every 10 meters, which means the air in that pocket was compressed. Compressed air behaves differently than normal atmospheric air. The oxygen content is the same percentage, but the absolute quantity of oxygen in a given breath is higher, which means breathing feels different, feels easier in some ways, which is the specific cruelty of the situation, because easier breathing uses more oxygen per breath, not less. Because the compressed air contains more nitrogen, which the body absorbs into the blood and the tissues at elevated pressure, and which becomes dangerous if the pressure changes rapidly, which it would if rescue came and came quickly, which is a problem for later, which is a problem he cannot think about yet, because the immediate problem is that the air is finite and the space is sealed, and finite air in a sealed space runs in one direction only. He did the arithmetic. The space he was in was approximately the size of a small bathroom, which it was, which means the volume of air available to him was perhaps 5 to 6 cubic meters. The human body at rest consumes approximately half a liter of oxygen per minute and produces carbon dioxide at a similar rate. And carbon dioxide in a closed space accumulates, and when carbon dioxide reaches approximately 5% of the air mixture, the human body begins to experience respiratory distress, and at 10%, the body cannot maintain consciousness, and at concentrations above that, the outcomes are not recoverable. At rest, in a small sealed space, a single person might have 12 to 16 hours of breathable air. Might. Depending on the space, depending on the person, depending on whether panic is driving the breathing rate up into ranges that consume the available oxygen in hours rather than in a day. He was not panicking. This requires explanation because it is the most counterintuitive element of the account he later gave. He was not panicking not because he was not afraid. He was afraid at a level that transcends the word afraid, but because he understood something that panic would not allow him to understand, which is that panic in this space was the same as dying faster. Every elevated heartbeat cost oxygen. Every sharp breath of fear took from the finite supply. The management of breathing, the conscious control of respiratory rate, was not a technique or a training or a discipline in the conventional sense. It was arithmetic, and the arithmetic was simple: slow down or die. He stood in the dark water and he breathed slowly. The cold worked on him from the outside while the mathematics worked on him from the inside, and the two processes had different timelines that he could not fully calculate but could estimate. Hypothermia in water at 4 degrees Celsius without a wetsuit produces unconsciousness within approximately 30 to 60 minutes in most people. He was not in the water fully, was not submerged, was standing in it to his waist, which extends the timeline but does not eliminate it because the water against his legs and lower torso was conducting heat out of him at a rate that could not be compensated for by the metabolic heat the body produces. His legs would go numb first, which they did, and then the numbness would move upward, which it would, and the body would eventually begin shunting blood from the extremities to protect the core, which is the mechanism by which the body tries to keep the heart and lungs functional while sacrificing everything else. He found material, pieces of clothing, a mattress, a towel. He wrapped what he could around his lower body and stood on the mattress to get some insulation between himself and the metal floor that was conducting cold directly into his feet. These were small measures. They were not sufficient to stop what was happening. They were sufficient to slow it. The darkness had a quality he struggled to describe later. He said it was not like closing your eyes, because closing your eyes is a voluntary act that the mind understands as temporary and therefore manageable, because the mind knows the eyes can open. This darkness was not like that. This darkness had no exit condition that his will could access. He could not open his eyes into light. He could open his eyes into nothing, which after some hours began to feel the same as keeping them closed, which was the first step toward the specific kind of disorientation that prolonged sensory deprivation produces. The sounds the ship made were constant and had their own language, metal contracting and expanding under pressure, the specific groaning of structural elements responding to the weight of water above them, compartments settling, the hiss of air moving through gaps as water pressure equalized in the sections of the vessel that were fully flooded. He learned to read these sounds over the first hours, the way a person learns to read the sounds of a house they have lived in long enough. To distinguish between sounds that meant the structure was stable and sounds that meant it was changing. Changing was not necessarily worse. Changing was just information. He needed information. He had nothing to drink. This is the specific cruelty of the ocean that people who have not been at sea in an emergency sometimes do not immediately understand. He was surrounded by water. He was standing in water. The water was inside the ship and outside the ship, and above him and below him, and it pressed against every surface, and it could not be drunk because it was seawater, and seawater accelerates dehydration rather than relieving it. And so he was thirsty in the way that a man surrounded by something that looks like what he needs, but is poisonous is thirsty, which is a specific and additional form of torture layered on everything else. He prayed. He has spoken about this publicly. He prayed with the specific quality of prayer that emerges when the mind has exhausted every practical option and turns to something beyond the practical. And the prayers were not dramatic, were not the prayers of movies, were not speeches. They were repetition. They were names. His wife's name, repeated in the dark, a sound he made with his own voice in the sealed space at the bottom of the Atlantic, because his wife's name was the specific thing his mind held on to when everything else was trying to come apart. If you are feeling what he felt, even a fraction of the weight of it, leave a like on this video right now and subscribe to The Human Limit, because we are not close to done, and what comes next in the dark is the part that I would give anything to unknow. The second day arrived, and he had no way to confirm it was the second day, except by the counting he had been doing. A rough counting of his own breaths and his own prayers, and the intervals between the sounds the ship made. A counting that was not precise and could not be precise, but was the only clock available to him. The air had changed. The quality of each breath was subtly different, slightly less satisfying, the specific feeling that the air is thinner than it was, which is what happens when oxygen is being depleted and carbon dioxide is accumulating, and the ratio of the two is shifting toward the dangerous end of the range. And then he heard something new. It did not announce itself. It arrived as a change in the acoustic character of the water outside the bulkhead door of the bathroom where he stood. A change from the sounds the ship had been making, which were structural, which were metal, to something else. Something that was not metal. Something that was organic. Something that moved through the water with the specific pattern of propulsion, rather than the random movement of debris. He knew immediately what it was. Not what species. He could not have told you what was in the water on the other side of the door. But the ocean at 30 meters depth in open water with 11 human bodies available as a food source does not remain an empty space. The oceanic food chain is efficient in a way that is not cruel, because it has no capacity for cruelty, but only for efficiency. And efficiency means that caloric content in the water column is located and consumed by the organisms that have evolved to locate and consume it. The 11 men who had been on the ship with him were in the flooded compartments, and the ocean had found them. The sounds were not the sounds of movies. This is important to say because the sounds of movies are designed by people who want to provoke a specific emotional response in an audience and are not constrained by accuracy. The actual sounds, the sounds he heard through the metal door of a flooded tugboat at the bottom of the Atlantic, were not dramatic. They were worse than dramatic because they were mundane, because they had the specific everyday quality of consumption, of a process proceeding without urgency or drama because it needed neither, because what was happening on the other side of the door was simply the ocean being the ocean, doing what the ocean does, and the doing of it was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard in his life, precisely because of how ordinary it sounded. He did not move. He understood that movement produced sound, and sound was information, and he did not want to be a source of information to what was in the water. He stood in the dark in the 4-degree water, with his hands against the door, and he listened to the sounds of what was outside. And he did not move, and he did not make a sound, and he breathed slowly, 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out, the way he had learned over the hours to breathe when he needed to consume the minimum, when he needed the air to last. The door was his only barrier. He thought about this constantly through the sounds outside. The door was not thick. It was a standard interior ship's door, designed to provide privacy and limited sound isolation between compartments, not designed to prevent entry by anything with the intention and the physical capacity to enter. He had wedged it closed with what he could find, had pressed himself against it at times when the sounds outside intensified, had put his weight against it with the specific futility of someone who understands that his weight is not the relevant variable, but has no other variable to offer. He thought about his family. He has spoken about this in interviews that I find impossible to read without stopping. Not because they are dramatic, but because they are not. He describes thinking about specific, ordinary things, a meal his wife cooked, the way his children slept, a conversation with his father that he had never finished, the accumulated ordinary texture of a life that he was standing in the dark deciding to return to. He decided to return to it not in the heroic sense, but in the functional sense, the sense in which deciding means orienting all available resources toward a specific outcome and refusing to allow those resources to be consumed by the alternatives. He decided to live, and then he stood in the water and breathed slowly and waited for something to change. The sounds from outside the door continued through what he counted as the second night. At some point during the third day, the sounds changed again. Not the organic sounds, those continued intermittently, but new sounds, sounds from above, sounds that had a different quality than anything the settling ship had produced, sounds that were purposeful rather than structural, sounds that were someone moving through the water with intention and direction. He did not know if they were coming for him. He had no way to know if anyone was looking, had no way to know if the ship's position had been reported, had no way to know if the time that had passed was sufficient for a surface rescue operation to have been organized and deployed. He knew only that the sounds from above were different from the sounds of the ship, and different from the sounds of what had been in the water, and different was enough to work with. He began to make noise, not screaming. Screaming would have consumed oxygen at a rate the supply could not sustain. He banged on the walls of the compartment with his hands, rhythmically, the universal distress signal of something that needs to be found. 3 strikes, pause. 3 strikes, pause. The pattern that means I am here rather than I am gone. The specific communication of a living person trapped inside something that the world has concluded contains only the dead. The recovery divers who entered the wreck that day were not looking for survivors. This also requires a moment to understand fully. 3 days had passed since the sinking. The survival statistics for 3 days submerged in a wreck at 30 meters without equipment are the kind of statistics that are used to justify not searching for survivors. The mathematics of oxygen consumption, of cold water, of depth, of time produce a number that rounds to 0. The team that went into the water that morning was there to recover bodies, to begin the process of confirming who was lost and returning them to their families. They were prepared for what they expected to find. One diver moved through the interior of the flooded vessel with his light and his body and his training and his professional composure, moving through compartments that had the specific quality of wrecks that contain the dead, a quality that experienced divers describe as a thickness to the darkness, a weight to the silence. And he came to a bulkhead door and his light found a hand in the water. A dead hand, he assumed. A body that had risen to the surface level of this compartment, floating against the door. He reached for it to move it, to do the work he had come to do. The hand grabbed him. The grip was not the grip of a floating body. It was the grip of a living hand, of a person who had been in the dark for 72 hours, waiting for something to grab onto, and had grabbed. The diver has described what he felt in that moment, and the description is inadequate to the experience. But what he says is that every reflex he had told him to pull away, that every trained and untrained response to an unexpected grip in dark water is to withdraw from it. And he did not withdraw, because his brain processed the information faster than his reflexes could respond. And the information was that the hand was alive, and the hand was holding him, and he was not going to be the person who let go. He found an air pocket, and he communicated through the door, and the voice that came back from the other side of the door was the voice of a man who had been in the dark for 3 days at the bottom of the ocean. And it was hoarse, and it was quiet, and it was the most coherent and specific voice the diver had ever heard in those conditions, providing information about his state, about the air, about the temperature, about what he needed, because he had spent 72 hours rehearsing for exactly this conversation, and he was not going to waste it. The extraction required time and care and the management of a problem that is not intuitive to people who have not spent time in pressurized environments. He had been breathing compressed air at 3 atmospheres of pressure for 72 hours. The nitrogen in that air had dissolved into his blood and his tissues at elevated concentration, the way carbon dioxide dissolves into a pressured beverage, held in solution by the pressure that surrounded him. If that pressure were to decrease rapidly, the nitrogen would come out of solution in the blood and the tissues in the same way that a pressurized beverage releases its gas when opened, forming bubbles in the blood vessels and the joints and the soft tissues, causing a condition that can kill or cause permanent neurological damage in minutes. He could not simply be pulled to the surface. The ascent had to be controlled, stopping at intervals to allow the nitrogen to leave his tissues slowly, allowing the pressure to decrease at a rate his body could manage, rather than a rate the human desire to get out of the water and back to the surface would prefer. He was on a stretcher in the water for hours during this ascent, being attended by divers who were managing his pressure exposure while also managing their own, rising through 30 meters of Atlantic water in stages that have been calculated for his physiology and his exposure time. The surface came eventually. He has described seeing light for the first time after 72 hours of darkness, and the description is something that people who have not been in total darkness for that duration cannot fully process. The visual system, after prolonged deprivation of any input, does not simply return to normal function when light is reintroduced. The light was overwhelming, was painful, was something his eyes did not have the capacity to process normally after 3 days without any photons to work with. He could not see in the conventional sense. He experienced light as a sensation rather than as information, as something his nervous system received without being able to make ordinary use of it. He was on the surface. He was breathing air that had not been breathed before. He was surrounded by people who knew he was alive because he was alive, and they could see him being alive. And the arithmetic that had governed everything for 72 hours, the counting of breaths and the management of oxygen, and the calculation of how much time remained, was no longer the operating framework. He was treated for hypothermia. His skin had been in contact with seawater for 3 days, and had the specific damage that prolonged seawater immersion produces, a breakdown of the outer layers that is painful and slow to heal. He had decompression sickness symptoms that required treatment in a hyperbaric chamber, additional time in a pressurized environment, but one that was controlled and attended, and not the sealed black space of the wreck. He was nourished and warmed and examined, and the people who did these things to him did not say much because there was not much to say, because what had happened to him was not adequately addressed by the vocabulary of medical assessment. He went home. His wife was there. His children were there. The meal was there eventually. The conversation was there eventually. The ordinary texture of the life he had been holding in his mind at the bottom of the ocean was there eventually, and he entered it, and he has lived in it since. He has spoken about what those 3 days did to his relationship with darkness, with water, with the specific sounds of things that are not the sounds of human beings. He has spoken about what it did to his prayers, which are still repetitive, which still contain his wife's name, but which now contain it differently, with a specific quality of knowledge that was not there before, the knowledge of what it sounds like to say her name in the dark at the bottom of the ocean and have it be the only evidence that you still exist. He has spoken about the sounds from outside the door. He does not describe them in detail in public contexts, and I will honor that boundary. He has said only that he understood what was happening and that understanding it was a specific and separate terror from every other terror he experienced in that space. The terror of being present for something that no human being is meant to witness, in a place no human being is meant to be. listening through 4 centimeters of steel to the ocean doing what the ocean does, which is to take what is offered without sentiment and without pause, and to hold himself very still and breathe very slowly, and wait for something that was not the ocean to find him. Something found him. That is the human limit. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have held on to in the dark, what name you would have said to yourself, what piece of the ordinary world you would have carried into that space to keep the space from being everything. I read every single comment. I will be back with another story from the place where human beings find out what they are when the water is rising and the light is gone, and the only available resource is the decision to still be here when something comes. The ocean is still there. The wreck is still there. The 30 meters of Atlantic water has not changed its character or its temperature or its willingness to take what enters it and hold it until something comes to retrieve it. He is on the surface. He has been on the surface since the hand in the dark grabbed a glove and held on. And the distance between those two facts is where everything important about human beings lives, in the gap between the place where the arithmetic says it ends and the place where something in us says it does not.